Nearly there. This paper is a variation, kind of, on an exhibition which is about to open shortly in Al Dhafra. And I would just like to point out there's a small correction in the abstract, that all the elements and all the F's in the title should be capital F's and not as in your abstract. So that the last item that is referred to there is actually an architectural device used from the 18th century onwards to enhance the natural landscape, often inspired by Romanticism, and it doesn't refer to anything else. As some of you may know, let me turn back to that one. Al Dhafra is currently something of a hot topic, and DCT is working on a new cultural tourism strategy in which, along with glamping and balloon rides, one of the offerings that's provisionally been entitled Fortress Adventures. So our thanks, therefore, to Peter today and the rest of the conference organisers for giving us an opportune moment to describe some of our own fortress adventures over the past 5 or 6 years, and consider briefly what the various components listed in the title tell us about the cultural landscape of Al Dhafra, past and present. Al Dhafra, also known as the Western region, Al Gharbiya. I use this map because although on it you see Baynuna as just the kind of area that it's currently used for, I think historically it was used for the whole area as well, another word for Al Dhafra and Al Gharbiya. And it's quite an interesting word, Baynuna, effectively between Bahrain and Oman. It comprises more than 80% of the area of Abu Dhabi, but contains the smallest part of its population. Away from the coast, much of it is taken up by the wilderness of the Arabian Desert. Historically, i.e. over the past several hundred years, the domain of pastoral and semi-nomadic tribes with an economic basis of date palm cultivation and herding, supplemented by seasonal maritime activities like fishing and pearling. Within this marginal cultural landscape, there are, however, a surprisingly large number of points of reference in what it first appears to be empty and trackless wastes. All of these are less surprisingly connected with water, whether they be wells, permanent or semi-permanent plantations, and areas of seasonal grazing. Another factor contributing to this sense that something is missing from the cultural landscape is the impermanent, you also say sustainable, nature of the available historic building materials, which has left few traces of sometimes substantial Arish settlements that existed, for example, in parts of Liwa, that oral histories tell us were usually built by the women of the community coming together and generally located on the high dunes to catch a breeze. I was going to say, from an archaeological point of view, Al Dhafra remains largely unexplored, but I better not say that after Hamdan's presentation. And also I was going to perhaps say that there has been some work done. Adias did some, Peter talked about it yesterday, and also Heiko is here, so he did some work in Liwa as well, looking at the Neolithic. So it's fairly unexplored. Partially a result of the difficulties that Hamdan explained with travel and if you don't have a buggy, and as well as in modern times by problems with permissions and restrictions of other government agencies. In consequence, our view, our image of the relationship between the fixed points that we know about and the semi-nomadic lifestyle represented by finds of material culture is still a rather black and white one, well, at least some of ours is, that leans rather heavily on oral histories and descriptions and photographs of desert travelers from Doughty in the 1870s through Thesiger in the 40s, Kodrai in the 50s, when the first maps of the area were produced. Since 2012, we've worked at a number of historic buildings in Al Dhafra, rather pleasingly from Hassan in the west to Hassan in the east, and we're taking in a number of the little Hassoun in between. Today, I'm just going to talk about the ones that are highlighted there. As you can see, a lot of the work is related to conservation and documentation of the surviving historic buildings in this area. Much of the stimulus for the work and the new archaeological data it's produced has actually come from the activities, indirectly perhaps, of the Western Region Forts Committee under the patronage of Sheikh Hamdan, which has been seeking to enhance the cultural landscape of Al Dhafra by constructing a series of new forts that reference the most tangible and salient features of the historic landscape and aim to fill the apparent void left by their decline and disappearance. The Liwa forts guard a group of historic settlements and palm groves that were at least partially occupied all year round in the central part of the Liwa Crescent. The landscape of Liwa, the cultural landscape, is composed of many tiny oases located in the hollows between the great sand mountains of Al-Batin that form the northern edge of the Rub al-Khali. Groundwater found a few feet below the ground in these sheltered locations nourished a crescent-shaped series of palm groves and villages extending some 80 kilometers from west to east. And there's just a map showing the layout of them. You notice they're all north of the present east-west road through Liwa, and they're also showing some of the typological things. The red ones are the two that we're going to talk about in Liwa today. Only two of these historic buildings actually survive as authentic historic structures, but we have archive photographs from a number of others showing how they gradually fell into ruin from the time they were first noted or photographed around the 1950s. The rest were rebuilt at the direction of Sheikh Zayed from the early 1990s. As with today, and part of an attempt to arrest the loss of cultural material that he saw going on and enhance the landscape by rebuilding, based on oral histories and collective memories, what were considered to be its principal and most distinctive historic features. I was going to talk about Castle Hassan, which kind of comes into that, which has reconstructed the inner fort in the same period. These archive photographs and our recent archaeological investigations show that originally these structures typically comprised a stone watchtower surrounded by a low enclosure wall where animals could be corralled in case of an attack, or maybe just to keep them in. The watchtowers were built of coarse stone rubble quarried on the spot, while the spacing and the location in relation to each other suggest they may have been intended to form a chain of intervisible watchtowers, perhaps analogous to those found on Abu Dhabi Island from the middle of the 19th century on, as we know from naval charts. A similar 19th century dating is suggested by the limited ceramics we found during excavations at these sites and by the oral histories collected in the 1950s at the time of the Brahmi dispute. Of the two surviving authentic towers, the now ruined town of Hassan or Huwaila once defended the approach to the western end of the Liwa Crescent. Archive photos show that the tower was still largely standing in the 60s and collapsed material was still on the surface when we first visited the site in 2008. Before any archaeological work was carried out, we carried out a 3D laser scan to record the exact position of the stones and to allow a possible future anastylosis reconstruction. That is the tower being built adjacent to the historic tower of Hassan by the Western Region Forts Committee. The second, so I'm very glad I got this picture. It's got the crenellations that everybody's been waiting for. This is the second surviving tower. It's at Hela, and its proximity to the nearby historic settlements of Hela itself, Tarak and Khanur, appear to have given it a number of alternative names that have been preserved or perhaps confused in oral histories. The tower, as you can see, is 4 meters. It kind of looks very much like this still. Is 4 meters in diameter and preserved intact to its full height, incorporating 2 tiers of gun loops for the defenders and a parapet with said crenellated battlements. Its authentic state of fabric and state of preservation together actually make it one of the most significant historic buildings in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, which does not have many buildings that fill those criteria. Archaeological geophysics showed the tower originally included an adjacent enclosure like the one we saw at Hassan, and an arrangement that is confirmed by archive photographs like this one. The third site I'm going to talk about is Hosn al-Sirra, and Tim's going to talk a little bit more about it as well. It's also known as Muntaka al-Sirra. You can see it there, and you can also see there's another site to the southeast of it called Al-Ramrama, which will also be mentioned. It's about 30 kilometers east of Medinat Zayed, where the desert terrain is moderately undulating and marked by extremely mobile sand dunes encroaching from the north due to the strong prevailing wind, so much so that the site currently doesn't look anything like this because half of it has been covered by the dune that you see approaching. The site was previously investigated by Adias in 1994 and 97. I think Mark was there then. And these investigations showed the site to consist, like as you see there, of a small mud brick enclosure with a square tower in the northeast corner. The recent work on the ceramics from the site that Tim will present in a minute, indicates that the main occupation, though not necessarily the fort itself, dates from the 14th to the 16th century and is therefore substantially earlier than the Liwa forts, although here again there is some evidence for a much more limited 18th and 19th century episode. So as I think Peter's gone now, but as he predicted in his book, Filling in the Blanks, this site continues to throw new light on an important but little-known period in the history of Abu Dhabi, preceding the movement of the Beni Yas tribes from the western region to Abu Dhabi. As with Hassan, further archaeological investigations, recent ones, have been hastened by the decision to construct what we're now calling Hassan Al Dhafra, where the exhibition is going to be held, another of the projects from the Western Region Committee. And it's located, there's a view of it, it's located immediately to the north and west of the archaeological site of Hosn al-Sirra. As with all these sites, we carried out topographical survey, drone-based topographical survey and geophysics. And this geophysical work produced more details on the structure, provided evidence for a possible enclosure and a suggestion that other features might represent metalworking on the site related to the slag and musket balls that we find. Although actually when we recently did a little ground truthing of this, we found that this anomaly, this rather nice pink one, was actually left, seems to have been a residual signal left in the bedrock by the teeth of a bulldozer. So that may be where the rest of the site went. The beginning of construction on the fort has given a further impetus to field survey in the area, and a detailed program of intensive and extensive fieldworking ceramic analysis was carried out in early 2017, and Tim's going to talk about that, so I'll hand over to him now.
Okay, so the nice thing about these conferences is that they focus the mind, and a lot of work that people have asked me to do over the past year or so, looking at different pottery that they've pulled from different sites. Really, I've spent the past few weeks obsessively going through all this stuff to get it ready. Okay, so it's a nice way to get through the publication backlog. A lot of this activity with the late Islamic pottery goes back to work that we did at multiple sites in Elaine with the Department of Culture and Tourism, And we were able to develop a late Islamic typology. Like I said, we've got about 300 years or so, from 1650 to 1950. And we have two major periods, late Islamic one, which is associated with quite good quality blue and white imports, these Gulf glazed wares, and the Iranian civic series of coinage, being then replaced by particularly, well, we'll see actually, being replaced then by these imported European types, poorer quality Chinese pottery, and a different type of coinage, essentially. So this is the chronological structure, this is the typology, which we're using to try and understand episodes of activity in these different sites. So I helped out Hamdan a little bit, and I helped out Mark a little bit, and now I'm helping Peter out, so generally I like to make myself helpful. So what do we find? Okay, so we did two, I suppose, types of survey here. First of all, we did an extensive survey. Now, this really was, grabbing pottery from the surface and putting it in bags with a GPS coordinate. And part of that really, it's not an ideal methodology, but, Peter's talked about the mobility of these dunes. It's quite a difficult area to kind of to work in some ways. And we wanted to try and understand the extent of the site, and also to try and collect any diagnostics which we didn't pick up in our more intensive survey, just to give us a kind of full chronological picture. So these grab finds, and they were important actually, but they didn't, as I said, we did an intensive survey as well, which we'll come back to, but a lot of these types weren't present in that, so we wouldn't have been able to get this kind of bigger chronological picture without that kind of extensive grab survey. We had a number of pieces of imported diagnostic types, including Celadon. Celadon, which I was delighted to find because it's just never been found in Elaine. The Middle Islamic period just isn't here. And we also, I think, this is more likely to be the kind of late Middle Islamic underglazed tradition, which I think is similar to the stuff that Derek's getting in Ras Al Khaimah. But it points already to this kind of 14th to 16th century occupation. And then we've also got something a bit later. This is, these types, this red-yellow type, which May talked about earlier, I now believe is a type fossil of the 18th to early 19th century. It doesn't appear, together with the European refined whitewares, it doesn't appear Al-Mataf, which is abandoned around 1600, so it's somewhere between 1600 and 1820 when we get the first European refined whitewares. It's broadly, let's call it the long 18th century. We have other sherds as well, like Bahla and Manga. At the moment, these are quite difficult to date. They're quite long ceramic traditions. I would love to have the time to be able to sit down and really go through this stuff and pull out a more refined chronology. But you know what life's like. It's difficult to find time for this sort of stuff. So we did an intensive survey. Now, the point of an intensive survey is that you've got 100% pickup. This is every single sherd which is found on the site is being collected to give you a representative sample of the site. Now, what we did essentially was we laid out a grid with these, 50 by 50 meter squares, or was it 20 by 20 meter squares? The point is, we laid out a grid so we had a nice handle on the ceramics, and that allowed us to do a full typological quantification. Now that is important because it's these presence, it's not just about the presence or absence of particular types of pottery, it's about their relative proportion. Like fashions come and go. People don't just stop using the Nokia and start using the iPhone. There's a switch slowly between them, and we can compare these these graphs, these quantified studies to the Elaine assemblage, where we have this nice stratigraphic sequence. Like the site at Sadiyat, we have a massive dominance of Julfawa, 90% Julfawa, okay? 10% everything else. Of the everything else, we have this ambiguous type white-red, which I'm not going to talk about today because it's still new to me and I'm not totally sure about it. But these are the rest of the assemblage. Not hugely helpful in some ways. But when we start looking at some of these, I wonder actually if we have a piece of Celadon, this up here. It might be Celadon. I'm not sure about this, to be honest. This is the profile. It's quite thin, maybe a bit too small for the Celadon. It does look a little bit like UA. The trouble with that is it's a UA. If it is UA, then UA is quite a bit earlier than the other ceramics. So, it'd be curious to see if we could, tie this down more specifically with a specialist on Chinese ceramics. However, the Jilfar types are really becoming extremely useful. Derek did a fantastic job right up until about 1600 with his work at Kush and Al-Mataf. But after that, he didn't have access to a stratified site. And, I'm hoping now actually with the work that they're doing in Jazirat al-Hamra that, we'll have a nice series of stratigraphic excavations to be able to compare to the stuff that we've been doing in Al Ain. So I got my students to help me. Students, wonderful, enthusiastic, hard-working individuals who really helped me with the typological quantification and also the drawing. These are all the rim profiles that the girls drew. Maybe not all of them, the angle's not quite right, but they're learning the techniques that they need to become professional archaeologists. We developed a typology. It's based on Al Ain, but we're looking always to try and add new types to this. We dropped Derek's system of numbers because they're difficult to remember, and when you want a shorthand, So we came up with appliqué band, which is dominant, the S shape, which is much less, and this rather fantastic duck beak, which even smaller. But these are the key types, okay? And when we look at this, this appliqué band, I don't know, there's a mistake here with the PowerPoint, but this is Derek's cooking pot CP 1.2. This is your classic Al-Mataf type, and that is absolutely dominant at this site. So I think that points to the 14th to 16th century. However, what we found when we worked in Al Ain is that this appliqué type continues after Al-Mataf. And actually, we're finding it in our earliest late Islamic levels, which I believe date to the late 17th, early 18th century. You can see we've still got CP 1.2, much less than when Derek has it, but after that it drops off and disappears completely. So I think Al-Mataf plugged into Al Ain allows us to kind of see that this, cooking pot 1.2, the appliqué band style, really goes from this late medieval into the early modern period. We still have a problem in the Emirates and the Gulf more generally with 17th century pottery. It's very difficult for us to identify 17th century material, but I suspect, given this evidence, that CP 1.2, the appliqué band, continues through the 17th century. Other types, we have then, a smaller amount of the S shape, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and the duck beak. And I think, when we start putting these together, we can come up with some of these nice patterns and talk about some of our chronological conclusions. The appliqué band type is absolutely dominant, and I think that pulls the main occupation of our site into the 14th to 16th century, late 14th to 16th century, based on analogies with Al-Mataf. It might actually continue into the 17th century. We're still not sure about the 17th century, so that remains an open question. We might have some earlier evidence. There's this strange type, which I called early lug. It's essentially the same as the CP 1.2, but it has lug handles instead of the appliqué band. And I look for parallels, and I wonder, this is yet to be confirmed, but it might be similar to some of the early Jilfar ware from Kush. But, that's yet to be determined. Again, if it is early, then it fits with the 13th century UA. So, really, just to conclude, main period of occupation, late 14th to 16th century, maybe into the 17th, and a much, much less significant 18th to early 19th century occupation with these imported types kind of backing up the picture from the Jilfar ware. So, lovely. Thank you very much.